Well, this is my third time trying to film this. It seems like every time I try to film it, one of my neighbors starts up his weed whacker, starts mowing the lawn. I'm not sure what's coming next. I'm at this point expecting someone to start vacuuming their grass. So we'll see if we can get through this. But that does lead me to an important point here. I'm actually building out a new YouTube studio in my basement, and it's gonna give us a lot more opportunities for some cool reviews. For one thing, I'm gonna have everything set up all the time instead of using a shared space. And that way it's gonna allow me to do reviews quicker, things like that. And I'm gonna get some new looks, some new setups. And I think it should be good for you and for me, really. It's gonna be a really good thing for the channel. So just stick with me. You're gonna notice some changes here and there as I make that transition, as I'm still trying to get the space ready. It takes a while to get, furniture in place, all the storage I'm looking for, the different changes for filming, lighting, all that kind of thing. So it'll be a little bit, but we're definitely moving in that direction, and it's gonna be really cool. But today we're going to look at a sub $100 speaker, which is nearly impossible to find anymore. And in this case, it's actually $69, which is crazy cheap. There's really not much on the market that's out there for this type of thing. There's actually one cheaper than this too. It's called the Dayton B40, I think. Instead of the 6.5-inch woofer, I think that one's probably a 5.25, something like that. But that's kind of wild because when we think about it, there's hardly anything out there anymore that matches up to this kind of price. We used to have the Sony SSCS5, which you could get for those cheap prices, and forget that, that's just not gonna happen anymore. I actually checked the price right before filming this, and it was just about $200. If you're lucky, you might be able to find one of those for $140, $150 if it's on sale, but those days of sub $100 speakers like that, they're gone. Another one I picked up would be the ELAC BS41. I actually picked that one up for $79 when it came out, and I'm not even sure anymore. That's probably double in price. I actually ended up selling that speaker. I still do have the Sony. It's just a really good one to have around for some of the comparisons to some of these cheaper models. But it's kind of moved on beyond the cheaper models. It's still a cheaper speaker, but it's no longer, a sub $100 speaker. And there's really only a few to compare in this area. This one is actually replacing a previous model, and from what I can tell on it, it seems to be an improvement in almost every single way. The original one on this was dirt cheap, and it had gradually risen in price over the years. But like I said, this one's $70. If we take a look at this one, it's a pretty small cabinet. It's a shallow cabinet, and that really allows this B65 to be placed just about anywhere. And I think that was their intention too. They even give you a wall hanger at the top here on the back. And that could be used for, like a rear surround. It could be hung up in your garage, really anything. And it's a sealed enclosure too. So the versatility on this is pretty high. And maybe that's a really smart move on these, because a lot of these aren't going to be purchased for maybe critical listening spaces. They might be purchased for the extra space, things like that. I mean, there's nothing wrong with you putting something like this together for your version of critical listening. That can vary for everyone. I mean, you can pair this with so many great options in budget Class D amps these days that your options are really endless. And if you do it right, you can actually get some really good sound from something like this. I'll talk about that a little bit later, how I would use this and maybe the best ways to get the most out of something like this. Talking a little bit more on that cabinet size, from what I understand, this one is a little bit wider, a little bit taller than the original, and that's probably because they were looking for a little bit more bass extension. Now, do you want to get a lot of bass extension on a speaker like this? Maybe, maybe not. When you're going on some of these cheaper models, a lot of times the deep bass isn't where they're going to excel. Sometimes that can be a bit of a thin line you're walking there. Do you want that deep bass that's just going to bring you to more distortion, or do you just want it to excel at what it does and pair it with something like a sub that'll do the job and take some of that heavy lifting off of the speaker and let the sub do what it does best? But getting back to the speaker here, what you get on this one is you get the speaker itself, you get the grill covers, you get some feet you can put on, and you even get speaker cables, which is kind of crazy. You get speaker cables on this. This is about as budget-friendly as you can get. Speakers, cables, all you need is throw together some cheap amp with it, and you're gonna be off and running, which is kind of wild for something like this for $70. And I really like it, that there's more things like that in the market. Not everything has to be super high dollar, super nice, super expensive. I really like that kind of equipment, but I also understand that this meets the needs for a lot of people as well. If we take a look at this one, it has a vinyl veneer, but it doesn't look overly cheap in my opinion. It actually looks pretty well put together for the price. You have to look at it kind of close to see that it's not actually a real wood, which is a good sign because sometimes these are just like this shiny sticker look that looks really cheap, and this one is actually a step above that. I would say it's a step above what you get on something like the Sony SSCS5, which that one has the vinyl on it too, but it's just kind of like a rough black texture that seems to be, it doesn't wear that easy. You can barely touch it and you might damage it. This one actually seems to be pretty well put together, and I think it's going to be mostly resistant to scratches too. If you look at some of the other options out there as far as how the enclosure looks, you can get a couple of options. There's this all black look, the black, gray, that kind of look, and the cover, you know, being black, or you can go and get the one that has more of the imitation walnut, and I think that one's actually a pretty good look too. It just depends on your space, what you like. When you look at these, they are called the Classic, and that really comes to life here. I mean, it looks kind of like a vintage speaker. It's like a boxy design, kind of like a lot of the big 70 box style speakers, that kind of thing. So they're executing it as what they say it is, essentially. And if you compare this to the old version, this is a big step up on how it looks, mainly from what the actual enclosure looked like. I mean, you didn't used to be able to get this wood imitation look, anything like that. It was more of just like a painted finish, I believe. And these actually look decent for $70. I'll give them that. What we get on this one is a 1-inch dome tweeter, the polywoofer. It's a sealed design, like I said. Flipping it around, we get rid of the spring terminals that were on the previous generation, and we go to more of the banana plugs, which is a good move because spring terminals, they're pretty weak in my opinion. Weak in a couple of ways, that they pull out easy. It never seems like a great connection. And just the fact that you're limited in how big of a speaker cable you can use, the gauge. A lot of times you have to use something pretty small. And not like this speaker is gonna need some huge gauge, you know, 0 gauge speaker wire or anything like that. It won't. But a lot of times the speaker cables we have around for maybe our other speakers, things like that, they tend to be, you know, they might be 12 gauge, something along those lines, and a lot of times that size of speaker cable can be difficult to fit into those spring style terminals. So this one opens it up, banana plugs, whatever, bare wire. They've got you covered in both ways here. If we look inside this one, we get some real changes here, and mainly that it has a real crossover. The original just had a capacitor for the tweeter. There's nothing fancy here, and I certainly wouldn't expect there to be in a $70 speaker. It's a simple second order crossover, 2 caps, 2 chokes. It's about exactly what I would expect at this price point, but it should really improve the performance if we were to compare these directly between the old one and the new one. The transition between drivers, that kind of thing, it's all gonna be, you know, a lot more linear. If we look inside this one, we have some stuffing, just not a lot of stuffing, and there's really no bracing. Well, there's no bracing, cross bracing between the enclosure sides, top, bottom, side to side, things like that. There's a little bit of extra bracing if you look in the corners here, and plenty of glue. Maybe that extra glue is what we'll have to consider our bracing here. It looks like they may have missed a couple times. These might be something that you modify. You could bring in some dowels, really expand the bracing, things like that. Might be a good opportunity for that sort of thing. I know people, you know, did a lot of modifications, the old model, and maybe that's what's gonna happen with the new one as well. When you pick these up, you are gonna be surprised how light they are. The enclosure's not very thick, that kind of thing, and that's where I think there could be some benefit to adding some of that additional bracing. I mean, really, you can pick these up with one hand. They're essentially that light that it's really not a problem. Like I can just use my fingers here and I'll pick this guy up like this. But that doesn't mean necessarily that I'm saying it's bad either. It's a lightweight enclosure, but it didn't seem to be picking up too much box, you know, liveliness. That resonance doesn't seem to be a problem with the speaker when I was listening. And I think that's also going to be kind of dependent on how you use this. Like I mentioned earlier, I talked about how you'd use it to get the best effect on this. If you avoid, you know, making this speaker work too hard for the lower frequencies, it's going to be your best bet on something like this. Pair this up with something like, you know, a Wii amp so that this doesn't have to take on the low frequencies, the low bass frequencies, where it's just going to distort, you know, cause cabinet issues, that kind of thing. Let the speaker excel at what it does by just playing a little bit more of the higher frequencies. Let the sub handle everything else, and you're going to have a pretty good sounding system, honestly. I didn't pick up anything that really caught my attention too much. I thought the mid-range was maybe a little pronounced on it. It wasn't necessarily a totally neutral speaker, anything like that, but the sound was really pretty good for $70. And that's what I keep wanting to put out there, for $70. You have to remember what you're paying for. You shouldn't expect, full cal performance for $70. On the under $100 speaker game is not competitive because I have a feeling it's pretty hard to produce speakers this cheap these days. Dayton has the advantage because they make all these drivers, they have all these drivers on hand, and from what I understand, this one was all built in-house. So it gives them a lot more opportunity maybe where they can piece something together like this and still get out good performance. But you have to save money somewhere, and I would say areas that's occurring might be, the enclosure, it being a little bit thinner. You're probably also going to have to sacrifice in your driver selection as far as what you're going to be able to get out for the lower frequencies. Thankfully, Dayton also sells a number of subs, so it's pretty easy to pair something like that up or, put together a DIY build. There's plenty of material out there if you guys want to do something like that too. I don't actually have any speakers that are sub $100 here anymore, but if we want to compare it to speakers that when I purchased them, they were sub $100. I mean, there's the Sony SSCS5, which I do have a preference more to that sound rather than the B65, but the Sony is also 3 times the cost now, so it's really not even comparable. Some things that I think this one does well over the Sony, I felt like this was a little bit more of an easy listen. It's not quite, the Sony can be a bit of a detail hog in all honesty. Sometimes the highs can be just a little bit too pronounced. It's a good speaker, especially for the price, especially when it's, under $200. This one puts out a good listen. I don't think there's anything glaring that I really need to point out that's a problem with this one at its price point. You pair this with any of these budget class D amps. I really like, pairing something like this with the Wii amp, like I said, just because you get that bass management control, so you can take away some of maybe the problem areas on this and you let it excel in other areas, which is what you should really do on something like this if you're looking to put together maybe a music system. In almost all cases, you're gonna want to bring that sub in, especially if you're using this for, home theater or music really. Just if you avoid having this dig too deep, you're gonna keep a lot of those compromises out of this. And that's where some of the budget stuff can really come into play because it can excel in some areas, but it's not going to excel in all of them. Let it do what it does best, hand off the rest, and put together a decent system for a reasonably cheap price. End of the day, this is a sub $100 speaker, 70 actually, that sounds pretty good for the money. It fits most people's needs. It has a certain look to it, like that vintage look I was talking about. But they executed it pretty well in this case, especially for the price that comes with this. Pair it with the right equipment, I think you're going to be pretty happy. And it's flexible. You can put this thing pretty much anywhere. Even has a hanger on the back if you want to put it in your garage, anything like that. So while this isn't perfect, it's perfectly acceptable at $70. And I think it's, maybe one of the better choices you could get at this price range. It's one of the few, actually. Maybe you're putting together a system for someone else and it's their first system. This might be a good starting point on a speaker to get because it's not that easy to find them this cheap anymore. And this looks to be a pretty competent option. If you guys could, before you go, please like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. It really helps push these videos out to a much wider audience. And the wider audience I reach, the more equipment I get in, the more reviews I get out. It helps you, it helps me, it helps grow the community. Thanks, we'll talk later. See ya.